Thanks. Thanks for giving us time on a warm summer's evening. I'm sure it's going to be absolutely worth it. First of all, a plug for the Labour Housing Group. So we're a socialist society. Obviously, we try and bring influence to bear on housing policy matters within the Labour Party. Very active. Our officers, such as Sheila, have been brilliant in terms of making connections with the senior politicians in the Labour Party. So, having paid my subscription a while ago, I've forgotten how much it is, Sheila. Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
It's £25 for an individual, £5 on wage, and £30 for a Labour Party organisation or a trade union.
Okay, thanks, Sheila. So can I say to everybody who's a Labour Party member, that's possibly the best £25 you'll spend in a long while. During the pandemic, we've been taking the opportunity to have these events, these in conversation events. So we've been able to attract some fabulous speakers, not least tonight, to come and talk to us. I'm going to introduce the speakers, but one thing that Stuart said that really struck me is he wants this to be a conversation. So please kind of chip in with comments and questions as we're going along. Also check out the website, the the Labour Housing Group website, because we've already had fabulous talks, and the reason we're recording this one is so we can put it on the website so you can catch back up on talks we've already had. Part of this is to fill time so that latecomers can come in, and I think I've pretty much done that. So I just want to introduce our speakers tonight. So we have Helen Hayes MP, who's MP for Dulwich and West Norwood. Helen was elected in 2015. As a Southwark Labour Party member, I can tell you that Helen's got the reputation, well deserved, of being an excellent MP, although she's not actually my constituency MP. Helen was part of the shadow, was part of the shadow team, I think shadow minister for the Cabinet Office. Another speaker is Dr. Stuart Hodkinson, who's Professor of Critical Urban History at Leeds University, and Stuart's continuing our line of radical geographers. So we've already had Danny Dorling and we've had Nancy Cork. Stuart's got a proud history of supporting residents groups, and he's got a book out on the issues around fire safety called Safe as Housing, if you want to check that out. We've also got Phil Murphy, who's a former firefighter. Again, a formidable history of campaigning with local groups and a superb knowledge of fire safety issues. The way I've agreed that we'll structure this with the three speakers is that we'll ask Stuart to give us an overview of the big fire safety issues within the construction industry, problems around regulation. Ask Phil to come in and be a bit more granular with us and talk about more specifically about fire safety issues. And then ask Helen to polish off and talk about the pressure being applied in Parliament and how that relates to us as Labour Party members. So with no further waffle from me, can I hand over to Stuart?
Yes, you can. Hope everyone can hear me okay. I'll just put the microphone a bit closer. Is that okay? Yeah, Andy? Great. All right. Okay, well, I haven't got any slides, but I've got a few things to say. I think I've got 10 minutes, hopefully. Too much to say, too much to cover in 10 minutes, but I suppose I just want to give a broad overview of things that I think are most relevant to this discussion. So I suppose to begin with, just thinking about the significance of Grenfell as an actual disaster. You know, the fire took place on the 14th of June 2017. We should always remember the 72 people who died, the 201 households that were instantly made homeless, It was internationally the worst tower block fire since a 1974 building disaster in Brazil, when 189 people died, and in the UK, I think it's the deadliest multi-dwelling building fire on record. Certainly, most deadliest infrastructure disaster since Piper Alpha. So it was a monumental, appalling event, and it's something that we have to learn from. We have to really learn from. And the inquiry that's going on is against early expectations, doing quite a good job of really helping us to unearth not just what went on in that fire, but what went on more broadly. So I think we now know, and I'm not just focusing on Grenfell, I'm talking about in general, but I think we know that Grenfell was caused by a fatal refurbishment that turned a solid concrete building designed specifically to be very, very fire resilient and very safe in the event of a fire or some kind of structural issue, to being effectively a solid petrol block full of combustible materials, obviously on the outside of the building, with the ACM cladding and the insulation, and the whole structure, the way it was designed, the way it was fitted, and the way it operated on that night, simply created an incredible acceleration of fire across the building, and also released incredibly deadly gases, cyanide gas and carbon monoxide. Some people have talked about it being the equivalent of 32,000 litres of petrol being placed on the side of the building, and that's just the external part of the building. Think about all of the combustible materials inside people's homes. So what took place with the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower was to turn something designed to stop fire spreading into something that facilitated fire spread. And we also know that it wasn't just cladding, and there's been a bit of an over focus on cladding. But if you look at the public inquiry, look at what the various experts have been doing in pulling apart what they've been finding in terms of inspecting building and so on, there were multiple building failures that were present at Grenfell. From missing and defective fire barriers, the use of sort of flammable spray foam and rubber, unlawful front doors that didn't resist the spread of fire, all kinds of things didn't work as they should have done, and couldn't possibly have been lawful. But as we know, Grenfell Tower passed 16 council inspections, 16 building control inspections. Grenfell Tower was given a kind of a clean bill of health by the regulatory system prior to the fire breaking out. So it wasn't just about the way in which the building had been refurbished. It wasn't just about the materials that were used and the poor workmanship and the cost cutting and the profiteering. It was also about the way in which Grenfell itself had been regulated, how the regulatory system had failed. It completely failed to spot any of the things that had gone on, and maybe had been designed to fail, had been designed to turn a blind eye to all of those things, because it was all about enabling refurbishment, regeneration, new construction within a very sort of light touch regulatory framework. And as we know, since Grenfell, in the first weeks and months, the focus was all about social housing blocks. It was all about cladding, and gradually, as more and more investigations have been done, more and more campaigning and organising has kind of emerged around building safety, we've gone from a few dozen to a few hundred to maybe 1,000, now possibly somewhere around 3,000 high-rise blocks across England, just across England, with unsafe cladding and possibly other issues as well. That's around 1 in 4 high-rise buildings. So 1 in 4 high-rise buildings has got some form of combustible cladding that has to come off. And the numbers are still not accurate. There's been a total failure of government to really pin down which buildings have got which combinations of materials. There was a reluctance to test different combinations and different kinds of systems, probably because they knew that once they opened up the Pandora's box, they were going to see that so much of what had gone up was problematic. We don't know the extent of the problem in medium-rise and low-rise buildings, because there are so many of those buildings, and the regulations kind of permitted quite a lot of materials that are now seen as being, or were always seen as being, unsafe on there. So it's an enormous time bomb, ticking time bomb, and it will take decades and decades to obviously remediate and sort out. We've then seen how people can't sell their flats, people can't buy flats because of mortgage companies won't obviously lend out on a building that could be extremely unsafe. Then we've had the whole external walls survey process, where again it's not in the interests of fire engineers and surveyors to be passing buildings that could eventually come back to hit them down the line. So there's a high failure rate of those buildings, creating so many more problems, because it's not just the cladding. They're opening up the external wall systems. They're then thinking about how things in the building relate to things on the outside of the building, and they're finding things that people weren't previously ever thinking of looking for. Leaseholders obviously are being hit with enormous bills. I mean, average bills maybe 45,000, but we know that some people are being faced with bills of over 100,000 just for the cladding remediation. We've then got the wake watch costs, which are also being passed down to leaseholders, which are in excess of £400 million a year. We know that there are currently over 900 residential buildings in London alone with wake watch wardens in place. And so leaseholders, with the mounting service charge bills, are facing bankruptcy. Some have already gone bankrupt, which simply increases the likelihood that those buildings will never be remediated, because every leasehold that's taken out of financing the refurbishment or the remediation just simply means the cost on everyone else goes up. That is inducing life-changing experiences on the residents, their mental health, their employment, their family life is being totally destroyed. And the campaign that's emerged is quite remarkable. I think the people are doing an incredible job, and we've now gone from something that was very sort of niche to being like a social movement is emerging, is awakening with protests and a lot of people getting involved. I just wanted to give you a quick example of a building you may be familiar with. This is Brindley House in Birmingham, which was built in 1968, actually as the sort of BT Telecom Exchange building. It was a 17-story building, and it was built over the canal. And it was sold in 2005 by British Waterways Limited to a developer, and converted in 2007 by Balfour Beatty in a 40 million project. And that kind of that conversion to residential made that building Birmingham's tallest residential block. There were 182 apartments, mainly private, some social housing, and people really thought it was a great development. Lots of people bought into the development, and for some it was like they'd spent plenty of time saving up to buy a house, to buy a flat, to have a little place of their own, and it was seen as a great opportunity to have somewhere to live that was theirs. And in 2015, the developer went bust. Residents took over, and after Grenfell, all of what people thought previously was a great place to live and a great investment turned out to be, just an unbelievable burden. The surveys that were done after Grenfell, and they weren't just done once, they were done multiple times, because the government never came in and said we're going to have a systematic survey here of all these potential buildings. It was done incrementally. So many surveys later that residents have all had to pay for. They found 3 different types of combustible cladding. They found missing cavity barriers. They found internal compartmentation problems, which have compromised the means of escape in the building. They found that a lift that was officially designated as a firefighting lift is not a firefighting lift, so it can't be used for evacuation during fire, which was particularly painful for a disabled resident who had been told that in the event of fire, don't worry, we'll be able to get you out in that firefighting lift. And that made her quite reassured. And once she was told that that wasn't the case, she became incredibly anxious, obviously, about what would happen in the event of a fire. And I know Phil will talk about all of that a bit later on. So the estimated remediation costs of this block are around £10 million. But the residents are being billed 18 grand a month for 2 waking watches. They want to install an alarm which will cost 178,000. but there's no guarantee that installing that alarm will remove the waking watches, because it'll all depend on the fire engineer signing that off and the fire brigade being happy with that. So their insurance costs have gone up by over 700%. They've already spent £1 million in unrecoverable costs. So this is just one example, and there are literally thousands of these examples of just lots and lots of construction refurbishment issues, products that aren't as they said they should be, that have been fitted, really sloppy workmanship, cost cutting, and obviously again the regulatory system has completely failed. And when I interviewed one of the residents at Brindley House, they told me something that was really, I think, quite powerful. And they said that when Grenfell first happened, it felt very abstract to them. It felt very remote and distant, like it wasn't really to do with them at all. And that was partly because the messaging was coming out, it was very specific type of material, ACM cladding. And now what he said was, as we've seen over time, it's not unique, it's incredibly commonplace, and it's only when you start peeling back the layers of these buildings that you start to understand that they've used lots of different kinds of materials, or they've not been constructed in the right way, or just very basic construction errors and what he calls profiteering and corner cutting. And those residents are learning an incredible amount about regulations, law, and all the dead ends there are in just trying to get buildings made safe. So I don't have a lot of time. I just wanted to sort of briefly stand back and think, how did this happen? Well, obviously, I think we just can't avoid talking about 30 to 40 years of a kind of deliberate set of policies that have all been about declaring war on regulation and regulatory governance, regulatory enforcement. Ever since the Conservatives came in 1979, created a deregulation unit in every government department. They then swept away, 300 odd pages of building regulations in 1984 and replaced them with just 24, and said it's not about stipulating things. It's about having a more flexible approach to regulation and interpretation of regulation, and all of that created the environment that we're seeing today. When the Labour government came in '97, they completely bought into this idea of deregulation. It was much more focused actually on dismantling regulatory enforcement bodies, and that's significant because if you think about building control, if you think about what building control was doing at Grenfell and has been doing on all these thousands of buildings, you've got to remember that by 2012, something like 85% of all building work that was previously requiring inspection had become self-certified work. So you've got, people on construction sites signing off their own work as being, compliant with the regulations. And I think that whole model is really at the heart of so many things that we're looking at today. When the Conservatives and the Coalition got back in 2010, it was all about 1 in, 2 out, 1 in, 3 out regulation rules. And we've just seen this incredible long-term downward trend in regulatory enforcement, where the average workplace would expect to see an inspector once every 50 years, as Steve Toombs and Dave White have shown in their research on statutory inspections across the regulatory system. We've also seen collusion and corruption in the Grenfell inquiry has really helped to open up just what levels of abomination are going on in the companies that are making and marketing, whether it be the cladding, the insulation, the fire doors and everything, who are lobbying all the time to persuade regulators that their products are safe to use. They're products that can't possibly be safe. But over time, government has helped to water down and create interesting ways around regulations, or ways in which they can be interpreted, through these large-scale tests that were for the cladding, which Celotex, which supplied the insulation at Grenfell, managed to get a pass in 2014, but they got a pass by, as they've admitted at the inquiry, by cheating, by falsifying technical drawings and failing to declare fire-resistant material had been included in the test. But they continue to market the products as suitable for use on high-rise buildings. Ministers have ignored decades of warnings about high-rise fire spread, cladding fires. Lakanal House was the fire in 2009 that has got all of the elements that we see in Grenfell that really should have led to a step change in regulation, both in terms of the governance of refurbishment, of building control, but also fire risk assessments, of the management of buildings. We should have had a much tougher stance on retrofitting sprinklers, and all the stuff that would have really made a huge difference at Grenfell. Just want to quickly say I've got a couple more things to say. The first is that Phil and I have been looking at Home Office fire data. We've been looking at incident data. We were given an unpublished version of fire incident data for individual dwelling incidents going back to 2010. So we've got about like 10 years of fire data that we've been working our way through. And there's so many things in there that are warning us of the next Grenfell. We're constantly told by people also in the inquiry who've been given evidence that high rise is not high risk, that compartmentation can almost always be relied upon in these buildings. It's so rare for fires to spread and so on. And what we found is that over the course of that decade, every 2 days on average, there is a fire in a purpose-built block of flats that has spread either from what appears to be the dwelling, from the flat, or from the compartment or the floor of that building by the time either the fire brigade have arrived or by the end of the firefighting activities. So that shouldn't really be happening, especially not in high-rise buildings. And so there's far more fires in high-rise than we were expecting that have got this kind of like unusual and significant fire spread. And when you compare fires that have got a fatality or casualty that have spread with those that haven't, you get a doubling. So you get a double the likelihood of a death or an injury from the fires that have spread. So we're not talking about with Lakanal and Grenfell, they get presented as exceptions to the rule, but actually the data tells us that there's something else going on, that there is actually quite a lot of significant there's fires that are not behaving according to the kind of mythology of how building regulations are supposed to have kept those buildings fire resistant. And also that delays to firefighting in blocks of flats are unbelievably commonplace. And you think about the fact that, pulling up at a house fire and pulling up at a block of flats are two completely different things. So the time taken is completely different. It's much longer to start firefighting activities in a block of flats. Between 2010 and 2020, just 3% of house fires experienced a delay to firefighting, whereas 20% of fires involving high-rise flats experienced a delay to the start of the fire. The firefighter actually putting water on the fire. So I can talk a lot more. I won't. I can talk about what the government's been doing and what they've not been doing. All I would just say is that what the government has done so far isn't even touching the surface of what's needed, isn't touching the surface of the problem. They've kind of moved things around. They've created a new regulatory system for high-rise buildings for the future, but they are still avoiding dealing with the present problem, which is the thousands of buildings that we know about and that we don't know about. And leaseholders will not fund the remediation of these buildings. They just can't. They can't afford it. It's not viable. So government has to step in. It's inevitable. And really, it's about whether or not they're going to step in before or after these buildings get turned into, very similar to what happened with the 2008 financial crisis. They get turned into distressed assets that get sold off in packages of buildings to vulture capitalists like Blackstone and others. They'll buy them up for really cheap, and then they'll probably put loads of tenants in there in potentially poor conditions, because that's what's been happening in other parts of the world since 2008 and the financial crisis. So I'll leave it there. Hope I've not taken too long. Thanks.
Stuart, that's chilling. You'll probably see that you've absolutely filled the chat up. So maybe if you can take some time to read through that, and we'll come back to that, including high praise from Robert Sale for your book. So if we can hand over to Phil now, please.
Hi everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to try and share my screen with you now. So are we working? Is that?
Yeah, that's all good, Phil.
Yeah, excellent. I'm going to kind of recontextualize the discussion a little bit to broaden it out and to try and demonstrate really how many strands there are to this issue. It is not a issue, fire safety in blocks of flats or fire safety in high-rise block. It's lots of things. And picking up where Stuart left off. Very modern buildings here, Worsley, 2007, on December the 17th, in that block of flats that you can see where I focused at the bottom. One of the householders had an overflow pipe coming out of the back of their boiler, a piece of copper pipe, which went outside and dripped out the condensation. And they had a plumber come round to extend that copper pipe outside of the house. The plumber welded on a piece of extra pipe. 2 hours later, the heat from that weld had caused the insulation to smoulder and catch fire in the cavity of the wall. These are timber framed buildings. Now, the building collapsed from the inside gradually. And the problem when you get fires in cavities is that you can't put water on them. I was a firefighter at a station in Moss Side in Greater Manchester for a long time. We were completely surrounded by flats. I've studied fire engineering, and believe me, from a practical and a technical perspective, it puts you in an impossible situation as a firefighter when you've got a fire like that. That building burned for 6 days, and the only way that they could put it out was to demolish the building. So that's what they did. They knocked it down. But you won't have seen that in the papers because nobody died at it. And this one in Hounslow in 2008, another timber frame building. Interestingly, between these two fires, in 2007, the Building Research Establishment did an experiment with a timber frame building in an aircraft hangar at a place called Cardington, and published a report sometime later saying that they found it to be absolutely fine. They got professionals in to build it perfectly and set fire to it. What they didn't say in the report was that in the middle of the night, there were embers in the cavity that reignited the structure and completely destroyed it. But they didn't put that in the report. And that's why people carried on building timber frame buildings. A cigarette was dropped just outside the front door of the block, and the fire smoldered up the cavity to the roof and took the rest of the building out. That's another one that had to be demolished. So we're talking about a very different set of problems here from the ones where we've got in traditional high rise. So now I'm saying this to you today against the background of this is the last day for the personal emergency evacuation plan consultation with the Home Office. So keep that in mind while we're having this conversation. Now, to again, recontextualize it really. This is where a lot of our attention goes when we talk about how efficient a fire service response is. And that's what matters to most people. If you can see in that graph, there's a faint grey line at the bottom. And for about the last few years, the last 7 years or so now, the attendance time or the response time to dwelling fires has been below 8 minutes. Now that's the time between a fire being discovered and the fire service arriving and putting the handbrake on. So there's a period before that, between ignition and discovery, over which the fire service have no control whatsoever. So if that's extended, that's a problem straight away because it means the fire is more developed when they arrive. So assuming that they'll arrive at an address after about 8 minutes, now on your average house fire, they pull up at the side of the street, they've got about 1,800 litres of water in the fire engine, and they pull off a high pressure hose reel and put water on the flyer within about 90 seconds. However, if that becomes extended, if perhaps the fire was burning for a long time before somebody discovered it, or there are problems setting up, or it takes time setting up. This research done in 2012 was a dive into the incident data that Stuart and I have been looking at. It had only been there for 3 years at this time, and they established quite clearly. I've added that line in where it says 20 minutes. But what this is showing here is that fatality and casualty rates, FCRs, rise as time goes on during a fire incident. And correspondingly, the people that will survive and be rescued, the number of those goes down as the incident progresses, and they become fatalities then. And there's an important point happens there at the 20-minute point. The likelihood of somebody surviving a domestic fire changed quite markedly. Now, this is a piece of research done by the Dutch Fire Service College at the Dutch Fire Academy. It's finally scientifically proven really what we always kind of thought in firefighting, and that was that the gases that Stuart was talking about, and the hydrogen cyanide, the carbon monoxide, well, these are invisible toxic gases. These can kill you within a few minutes if you get enough of them. And it is not safe to tell people if they cannot see smoke that they're okay. That simply is not true. And it's now been proven that in blocks of flats, hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide will travel unpredictably to places well remote from the fire and will not be seen. So they've immediately changed all their procedures now. And when they get a fire in a block of flats, they immediately evacuate everybody that shares the same corridor, because as soon as they open the front door to the flat where the fire is, then the escape route for the other people that face onto that corridor is effectively unsurvivable because of the gases that flood into it straight away. Now that 20-minute point, again coming to what Stuart said about the very different incidents. The house fire there, which you can see between about 8 and 10 minutes, they will have used the high pressure hose reel. You can see a picture of it there. Every fire engine's got 2 of them. You pull up, you put the handbrake on, you press a button, and you grab that reel, and you can then start a jet of water in through a convenient window, because obviously they're not very tall domestic houses. So even one pump can turn up at a house fire and start to work. Whereas really in Hertfordshire, after that awful fire at Harrow Court, the fatal high-rise incidents, they did some tests and showed that for their firefighters to set up with a safe system of work on the upper floors of a high-rise block takes about 20 minutes. So that period at which your survivability starts to go downhill is past. It takes 6 to 8 fire engines of crews to do that and to do it safely. And there are a whole multitude of things that can go wrong. I've highlighted a hydrant on there. A car can be parked on a hydrant can get jammed, a hydrant pit can get contaminated, a hydrant lid can get jammed in place. That's just the hydrant. And you can't fight a firefight in a high-rise building without having access to the hydrant, because it will use the 1,800 litres that you carry in, most of it just to fill the dry riser, which is the pipe that goes up through the building. Why does it matter so much? This is standard fire engineer evacuation theory. I don't know why discussions around evacuation strategies haven't really focused on this, because this is the way fire engineers calculate evacuation in every single type of building. In every other building you go in with your families, apart from residential buildings, there will be a plan, such as this one will have been done to calculate how long it's going to take everybody to get out. So the only building where you don't have an evacuation strategy as a member of the public when you go in is a block of flats. But that critical period there between the available time, which is how much time people have got before the means of escape become unsurvivable, and the required time, how long it takes people to get out. Like I said before, please bear in mind now, this is against the background of a personal emergency evacuation plan. Now, to ensure the safety of people in blocks of flats, we need to know how long it takes them to get out, and then work out the evacuation from there. So what am I telling people to do at the moment when I talk to people and they're worried? Well, here's some of the things I'm suggesting that they do. Get yourself an air horn so that it's easier to wake your neighbours. Look back at Richmond House in Worcester and the Barking fire. People were running around with pots and pans. At the Lighthouse in Manchester, there was a security guard screaming outside the block. Just give yourself an air horn so that it's easier to warn your neighbours. Get yourself an evacuation hood, a fire escape hood. You can get one of them for £100. Get all of your family members one, get a couple one, take them on holiday with you. You can also upgrade your domestic detection. You can get a fantastic grade C domestic detection system that's based on the commercial technology that's in offices now, and that's less than £200, and it's far superior to your average domestic smoke detector. And I'm telling people to get these little kits as well, with a little fire extinguisher and a little pan extinguishing stick in them. Most people do fight a fire if it's small and they have one at home. 75% of fires don't result in a call to the fire service, so equip yourself. So bringing that all together now, these are the original building code that was around at the time when Grenfell Tower was built, and it didn't mention stay put. And the evacuation strategy for Grenfell Tower and buildings of that age is unaided self-evacuation using a protected escape route. The phrase stay put is an evacuation strategy was invented in 2011. So why? Well, I mean, most people will be able to name one or two high-rise catastrophes that they're aware of. There are lots that people are not aware of, dozens of them, in fact, that we found that you will not have heard of. This is Stainer Court in Ramsgate in 2001, where basically wind, toward the top of a tall building, winds can pick up to 50 mile an hour. Isn't unusual, 100 mile an hour on occasions if it's a windy day, and if the wind's going in the wrong direction, the firefighters in this incident, when they opened the door of the flat, they described it as being stood in the backdraft of a jet engine, and immediately debris fell in the way of the front door and prevented them from closing it. So the staircase was quickly unsurvivable, and a number of people were rescued from the roof by a Coast Guard helicopter. This is Arlington House. This is in Kent as well. Just a couple of months beforehand, a wind-driven fire. That's the inside of one of the corridors at Arlington House before the fire, and that's what it looked like after the fire. You just need the wind to be going in the wrong direction, that's all. So what did Kent Fire and Rescue Service do about it? They said, we need to prioritise people's safety above our desperation to open the door and fight the fire. So they came up with a structured plan, which they've been using for 10 years now, which includes an option to evacuate people from a high-rise residential building. And it does so by protecting the stairs meticulously and using teams of firefighters to do that with gas monitoring systems. And finally, as I said, this is against the background of the last day of the Home Office consultation on PEEPs. And we hear a lot of discussion about whether high rise is high risk. We're going to hear a lot of talk about that later in this week when the author of the LGA Guide to Fire Safety in Purpose-Built Flats is questioned at the Grenfell inquiry. Well, 15 of those people, of those green hearts that are representing the people in Grenfell Tower, that's where they lived. 15 of those people were disabled. And I don't know how many of those people were there because they wouldn't leave disabled people in the block, but I know there were quite a few. And until everybody has got an evacuation strategy, I'm afraid we can't guarantee them that that isn't going to happen again. There's one, since there's been 15 ACM fires, really serious ACM cladding fires around the world since Grenfell. Nobody has died in any of them because everybody got out of the building. And that's the key to good fire safety. It gets people safely outside. Thanks.
Thanks, Sil. That was excellent. Helen, the huge challenge for you is, what can we do about this?
Thanks very much indeed, Andy, and thanks to Stuart and Phil as well. Those were both incredibly powerful presentations, and it's great to have the benefit of your detailed and expert knowledge as well for this discussion. So I'm, as Andy said, I'm Helen Hayes. I'm a backbench Labour MP representing Dulwich and West Norwood in South London, which is a constituency which has part of Southwark, where Andy is, but not the bit that Andy's in, and part of Lambeth. And my interest in this comes not because I'm not on Labour's front bench. I don't speak on this issue, and that falls to Lucy Powell as our shadow housing minister, and to Sarah Jones as the shadow minister with the fire safety brief within the Home Office, shadow Home Office team. My interest in this comes in part as a constituency MP who has a number of constituents, mainly on the Lambeth side of my constituency, who are still living with the consequences of the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, in that they are in buildings that have cladding and have fire safety issues, and they can't move because of the government's inability to so far to make meaningful progress in sorting out this scandal, but also because I was for 5 years on the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee at the time that the Grenfell Tower tragedy happened and in the immediate aftermath of it, and as a committee with responsibility for scrutinising the government's policies on housing, we took a very detailed, and the committee indeed continues to take a very detailed interest in fire safety and building safety issues, although I'm no longer on it. So I thought I'd just, I won't repeat what Stuart and Phil have said, but just to recap a little bit on the context, and then to talk about where we are now in Parliament and what Labour is calling for at the moment. So the starting point is obviously the utter horror of the Grenfell Tower fire, the appalling loss of life, and the devastating loss of homes and possessions. And we must always keep that in our minds when we talk about these issues. It was evident as we watched, even on that terrible day, the horrific images of the fire on our TV screens, that there was a problem with the cladding. Those comments were being made live as we were watching the desperate attempts to tackle that fire. The flames were very clearly spreading up the outside of the building, engulfing the whole building in fire, and the cladding appeared even to an uneducated observer to be fueling the fire. In the immediate aftermath, everyone, including the government, promised that all necessary action would be taken to ensure that such a tragedy could never happen again. And the first minimal necessary step was the removal of the same type of cladding which had proved to be so lethal at Grenfell Tower. And this is where I think we hit the first indication that there were going to be serious problems with the government's approach, because the government for many months focused only on the ACM type cladding used at Grenfell Tower. They had an incredibly slow process of testing other types of cladding through the BRE. But I remember sitting on the select committee and we were challenging the government sort of month after month after month on the lack of progress on just gathering the basic knowledge about what were all of the flammable types of cladding in use on buildings in the UK, and where were they, and therefore how big was the task to make buildings safe. It was discovered that many other buildings had other types of cladding which were also of a similar level of fire risk to the ACM cladding, but also that cladding was only one part of a much wider building safety scandal in the UK. So 4 years on, and we just marked last month the 4th anniversary of the Grenfell Tower tragedy. We still have around 33 buildings with the same Grenfell style ACM cladding on them. There are many more buildings with other types of flammable cladding, and leaseholders in particular are trapped. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that many have to have their lives on hold entirely. They are reliant on their building owner securing an EWS1 form to be able to sell their property, and until you can get those forms, many of those properties are essentially valued at zero. We have a situation where that there's a shortage of inspectors to do that work, but the inspections are often uncovering where they do take place much more extensive work than cladding replacement alone. We have a situation where the government is only partially funding building cladding replacement. And again, we saw this piecemeal approach where first of all, they announced funding for ACM cladding, but not for councils. Then they announced funding for that money would cover councils. Then they announced that there would be some funding for other types of non-ACM cladding, but it's been extremely piecemeal and the fund is not being well administered. So we know that only 10 pence in every pound of building safety fund has so far been drawn down. And there is no meaningful framework for addressing the non-cladding related fire safety issues. And then we have the issue of catastrophic costs. So leaseholders being charged thousands of pounds a year for waking watch patrols. Funding for that is very piecemeal. It came very late in the process, only sufficient to cover about half of the costs. And we have catastrophic costs being passed on to leaseholders who cannot raise the money by remortgaging. And I think it's really important that we hold in mind the human impacts that this mess is having on thousands and thousands of people, residents whose mental health is being profoundly impacted by the anxiety of living in an unsafe block or a block which might potentially be unsafe, but they don't know that yet because the inspections haven't been done, the financial hardship and ruin, and the strain of not being able to move on with your life. I have residents who are trapped living with partners from whom they've separated because they can't untangle their financial affairs, because they can't sell a property that they own jointly together. I've got residents who can't move, who've had children, who need to move to a bigger property, who can't do that. I've had residents who thought they were getting onto the property ladder and have now found themselves in just a state of financial desperation as a consequence of this problem. We're 4 years on from Grenfell Tower, but we're 3 years on from the publication of the Hackett report, which was criticised at the time because Dame Judith did not call for an outright ban on flammable cladding, and I think even she acknowledged that was a mistake. But that was a very detailed report which called for comprehensive reform of both the regulatory framework for the construction industry and the culture of the construction industry. And I think those two things are really important. I'm a very firm believer that regulation drives culture, and until you've got that comprehensive form of regulation, you're not going to change behaviour and practice in the parts of the construction industry that need to have that comprehensive change. And when I was on the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, we published a report, and there have been several reports of the committee since that time, that concluded that the cladding scandal could only be resolved by the government funding the costs of remedial works up front and reclaiming those costs from the construction industry later. And that committee is a cross-party committee with a majority of Conservative MPs, having looked at the evidence in detail, concluded there was no other way of solving it than by the government stumping up the funding up front and then reclaiming it later to protect leaseholders from those catastrophic costs. So we've seen a catalogue of failures and broken promises from this Tory government. We have got chaos now in the inspection regime, currently in the assessment regime. We've got private fire assessors who've got no interests in managing the costs, are incentivised to specify works at increased costs. We've got managing agents who have got no incentive to complete the works quickly, so long as they're still potentially liable for any of the costs. We've got a situation where the major works are complex, and we have an absence of the skills to take charge of managing and getting those works done. The government itself has no real handle on risk and on the hierarchy of risk. They've drawn an arbitrary line around 18 metres, but we know that height is not the only indicator of risk, and there are buildings that fall below 18 metres, which are also not safe, and there is no process at the moment for dealing with those buildings. And all the while, leaseholders are being pushed from pillar to post, paying hundreds of pounds every month, seeing their insurance premiums hike, or even worse, not being able to get insurance, paying for the waking watches. And that's before we even get to the meat for many buildings of the actual remediation costs themselves and how they will be funding. So the government has announced some plans for a levy on developers, but it hasn't come forward with any detail. And as far as we can tell so far from what we've seen, it's unlikely to raise a significant proportion of the cost of remediation. So what are we calling for as the Labour Party? We are calling for a building works agency to be established by the government. This is, it's different from what the government is proposing around a regulator. This is an agency that has the power to act, to do the works that are needed. It is based on a model from Victoria in Australia, and it would be an agency which has the power to carry out a full-scale audit of all of the works that are necessary. In Victoria, they have an agency which is proactively going to every building over 2 stories rather than waiting for building owners to self-report. It has the power to fix the buildings. It appoints a dedicated officer for each building. They appoint a project manager. They use their own fire engineers to assess the works that are necessary. They organise the insurance. They release the funds, and the same fire engineers sign off the building as safe at the end of the process. And meanwhile, the owners of those of flats in those buildings are able to sell because they have a certificate saying and confirming that the works will be done and paid for. So people's lives are able to move on even while they're waiting for works to be completed on their building. I would just add, as someone who takes an interest also in the planning system, that I think we absolutely need comprehensive reform of the regulation of the construction industry and of building control, and we need mechanisms for funding the upfront, the replacement of cladding, and we need a building works agency that can get on and deliver that work. But there are also deeper problems in our housing sector that we need to address. And I think amongst them is the issue of land reform, which I did quite a lot of work on in the last Parliament. We need land reform to bring down the cost of purchasing land for social housing, because the high cost of land is one of the factors that contributes to the cost engineering down, I think, of many building schemes that fuels that poor culture in the construction industry around quality and risk, and contributes to increased fire safety problems in some buildings. So I think we need to be looking, we will be doing the job of scrutinising the building safety bill as it's introduced in Parliament this week. We will be putting forward amendments around funding and around a building works agency and on many other detailed aspects of the bill. But I think these problems go very deep, and we need to be looking also at our planning system and at every way we can of making sure that future generations are protected from a tragedy like Grenfell ever happening again, but also that people who are still suffering the terrible consequences of that tragedy have the resolution that they desperately, desperately need.
Helen, that's incredibly powerful. Thank you. Sheila, you've worried me by saying we're about to run out of time. Do we need everybody to log off and back on again? How do we manage this?
No, not at all, but we can carry on as long as the speakers are available. But
it's not that we're going to lose our Zoom time or anything. Okay.
No, but we're going to go over the hour if people are able to stay for a bit longer.
Oh, I think everybody would want to, because yeah, we've had 3 really strong speakers. Robert Sale, I can see you've kind of dominated the chat. Do you want to come in with the first question or comment?
Yes, I only did that not because I want to take it all over, but because I feel very strongly about it from my own work experience. I was just going to put Duncan's book in the. I'm afraid he's not here. I thought he might be here actually.
Yeah.
I'd like Stuart in particular to answer the question about the regime, because I feel that what we're doing is, to be honest, ducking the issue. I mean, I spent the whole of my life working as an environmental health and housing officer. I got motivated to do that when I worked as a community work and vice worker in the early 80s in Lambeth, working primarily with council tenants associations, and also I had a tenants association of refugees in bed and breakfast. And that, to be honest with you, I didn't live like that when I was growing up, and that set me up for the whole of my career. And I think that this is not just about fire. It's about the other hazards that I mentioned: damp, mold, excess heat, actually, with the weather it is at the moment. And I feel that we must look at all of these things. I mean, Helen, your colleagues, you could have a chat with, Karen Buck and Andy Slaughter about some of the exactly the same issues in the area, certainly that I work, which are affecting blocks there and people's lives with damp and mold and heat and so on, as well as fire hazards. And the same sorts of issues that Stuart exposes in his book are the issues are at fault. And I feel that I'd like particularly to know, my understanding from talking to people who know an awful lot about this is that this question of the setting up of the European system, and this has nothing to do with Brexit, with the named person to stop this passing on subcontracting and subtendering legal responsibility for the work so that nobody can be held to account, is one of the biggest things that needs changing. And I understand that the industry is furiously worried and lobbying about the concern that might come out about that from the Grenfell inquiry. So could we, if that is the way forward, and perhaps Stuart could address that, please could we say so and then come forward with that? And yes, there's an issue with leaseholders. I did an inspection on the estate in Camden for a leaseholder. He was a caretaker and his wife was a health assistant. And there was a huge issue with that. But this isn't just about money. It's about health, life, death, and loads of misery that actually has been going on for a long, long time, including in the 4 excellent examples that Stuart covers in his book.
Robert, thanks for so I want to ask two of your excellent questions to the panel. So one is, how do we organise ourselves? So you've described an awful situation. What can we as Labour Party members and community activists do about it? And then the second part of Robert's question, how do we create transparency and accountability within the construction industry? So Stuart, do you want to kick in and then we'll go Phil and Helen?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Well, I completely agree with you and the comments you made in the chat, and I suppose what you're saying is we can't just isolate, building safety or fire safety. We've got to address the whole system that governs housing, land, the construction industry, how housing is seen in terms of what it is. So I do in my book talk quite a bit about that in the final chapter about actually what's happened here is that housing has been turned very deliberately into a commodity. Obviously, many things have a commodity aspect to their lives, but with housing is such an important part of our existence. It's so important for people to survive, to grow families, to have a place of security for themselves. It's a bedrock of a community. It's basically just an essential, fundamental aspect of social reproduction, a home, shelter, and protection. And the fact that it has been turned into an asset to be bought and sold, to be gambled and speculated on, to be seen purely in its monetary value, and for therefore all of the interests around that to effectively engage in speculation around land prices, house prices, future prices, and so on. It's what's happened in terms of the wider neoliberalization of society, the economy, and it's the results of decades of deliberate privatization, deregulation, liberalization of the market, let the market forces rip, and the state retreating more and more from providing a fundamental settlement, to trying to encourage everyone to be market actors and entrepreneurs and get on the housing ladder and make profit from it. And so that model has to be completely, yes, it has to be resisted, it has to be rebuilt. And I don't have like, I do have ideas and I wrote them in the book, but it's a social movement that will do that. It's not going to be any sort of tinkering and like a set of policies here or there. It's actually about how we think about home, what we think about our food, what we think about land, our relationship to land, and understanding how it's come to pass that we are alienated from these things and we see them as things to make profit from. So that's a big ideological shift, and that requires the Labour Party and it requires other political actors and forces in society to make that argument and not to duck it, obviously. And I felt that when Jeremy Corbyn was in charge, there was a concerted effort to change the story of what housing is, to put more emphasis on public housing, social housing, and to sort of really try to not amplify and inflate the housing market, but actually think about how we can deflate it, how we can actually make housing affordable and secure and safe for all. And that was the rhetoric, and that was the vibe, and that was very important. And if we don't have that discourse, then there isn't one. So, you know, if the Labour Party is not making that argument, but it's arguing for, you know, a more clever technocratic solution, then we're not having the big debates and the big arguments that change people's ideas about things and help people to make connections between what's happening to the cost of living, the cost of housing, job insecurity as well. They're all connected. So I completely agree with that as a principle. I think there are some really tricky issues to discuss about this, because, you know, there is the whole issue of you know, how historically we've done that through local authority construction, local authority management, direct management of housing, but local authorities also had a key role in building control, having monopoly of building control and inspection for a period of the post-war era. And, you know, I think that we've got to talk about, you know, also vested interests on the public side as well, and how do we remove conflict of interest. So we need to maybe think about a different system that's got different scales to it, where we have more national agencies doing certain things and more local agencies doing other things, that mean that there isn't this conflict of interest both on the private and the public side. And also, I don't think that all private building inspectors are bad. You know, I think there's some very excellent private building inspectors who just want a fair system that they can work in. And I would love to see many of those being brought into like more of a national, like a works agency, that a building works agency that Helen's talking about. You know, we've got to be really clear about this. So much of the knowledge and the skills of what used to be the local authority building, the works and the service teams, has been privatised, and it's gone. Yes, and I know Robert's talking about the BRE bringing that in. Absolutely, we need to nationalise knowledge. We need to collectivise the knowledge again. We need to not allow the private sector to have the monopoly on the solution to the problem as well, because that's what we're seeing at the moment, where all of the things that are being identified in the process of building inspections and surveys that are going on, it's all the private sector giving the private sector work. And that is what we've got to try and really radically push against. And it's hard to do that, but we should be arguing more for municipal, public agencies to do this kind of thing, and bringing back people from the private sector. And I know that cuts completely across the current government's agenda, and I know that might now seem quite radical given where we've travelled in the last 20 to 30 or 40 years. But we've got to start making the arguments. We've got to start bringing out the discourses so we can actually argue for them and convince people that this is what's needed. It's a bit like climate change. It's inconvenient truth, but if we don't do it, then we're going to have a terrible 20 to 30 years of sorting out all these problems. There won't be a housing market in some parts of the country, in some parts of cities, because there will be no buying and selling of homes. Everything will just dry up, and people will be trapped. So there's a practical and pragmatic reason for doing it. Anyway, I think I've answered that point.
Oh, excellent, Stuart. Phil, jump in.
I think Stuart's right. We need to re-regulate. As soon as you stop making new regulations for new things that are appearing on the market, you're losing ground, really. But with each opportunity that you miss to update the old regulations as well are a lost opportunity, which is why we've got 50-year-old single staircase high-rise buildings that have got no fire extinguishers, have got no fire alarms, and have got no sprinklers. That's ludicrous now. There is no way we would let somebody build that. So as well as regulating and looking again at what we require when there's large refurbishments and constructions and things like that, the non-detriment rule when refurbishment has got to be looked at. There's no reason we can't take out a really old lift that's rubbish and put in a firefighting lift that can be used to evacuate people. There's no reason not to do that. You know, there's no real reason not to put sprinklers in tower blocks anymore when it costs about £1,000 per apartment. If we had either an alternative escape route, sprinkler systems, fire alarms and evacuation strategies, if you have two of those three things, the people will get out of the building alive. And I'll tell you what, it would be billions of pounds cheaper than running around recladding them all and then taking them to take the fire alarms out, because that's what's going to happen under the current regulations. They won't actually know if they're in safe buildings, and they still won't be able to get out if there's a fire, perhaps, but somebody will have come along and changed the cladding for them. I think we need to look at long-term improvements and sprinklers in all high-rise buildings. And when people get organised, since the Tenant Services Authority was disbanded in 2010, 50% of the tenant and residents associations have dissolved. You know, we need to re-incentivise through housing providers people to independently organise and find a way for them to have a voice. It seems like the last thing that's being dealt with is the first thing that we found out, and that was that residents are being ignored, and tenants and residents everywhere are still being ignored, and all the changes are being made without them having that voice. That's why we had to take the government, threaten the government with a judicial review for using the British Standards Institute to try and undermine the Grenfell recommendations. You know, we've seen what the BRE has gotten up to since it's privatised. We know what the British Standards Institute are getting up to. We know that there's a lobby group within the Fire Industry Association that are closely tied to landlords. Along that, in that committee room where they made the decision that disabled people weren't going to have personal evacuation plans, it wasn't tenants and residents that were in there. It was Savills, it was CBRE, it was landlords. You know, they're making decisions that that don't have tenants and residents at the centre of them, frankly. And one of the big reasons for that is because tenants and residents don't have a voice. When they're starting to get organised now, I point them to a great website called Fix My Block. If you search for that website, it's got all sorts of high-rise stuff on there. It gives people support, making complaints about various specific issues, and gives them advice about forming a tenants and residents association as well. And that was built by the great people at Tower Blocks UK, Sam Webb and Danielle Gregory, who's on this call. So I'd make use of that. But yeah, we definitely need to incentivise people. We need to give them independence so that they can scrutinise their landlords, some of whom are too big. Thanks.
Yeah, well said, Phil. So Helen, how do we organise and how do we make the industry more transparent and accountable?
So I'm happy to answer. I wondered if you wanted to bring some more people in, because I'm conscious that we've been talking a lot on the panel, and there are lots of people who might want to ask questions, and then I mean, I'm happy to come back.
Yeah, that's very selfless of you. So anybody who hasn't asked a question, who wants to ask a question, jump in, please.
Hello. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So I just thinking that the more you look, the more you find, and obviously a lot of the high rise, may even be a low rise, are actually could be considered to be unsafe. And I do wonder about how we link refurbishment to the climate agenda. I think the party needs to think about that. But my bigger concern as a tenant, and it's probably an even bigger concern for leaseholders, is that if properties, if high-rise buildings are considered to be too expensive to refurbish, then the temptation will be to knock them down and start again, which might be a good idea in terms of safety, but will be hugely disruptive for tenants and extremely expensive for leaseholders. So I think the party needs to really have a view on that and think about that, because over the past 20 years or more, regeneration has not been a very kind or helpful process for tenants and leaseholders. Still isn't, and we have to own some responsibility as a party for not addressing those issues as well. There's been a mad rush to, let's build a state. So there hasn't been. Okay, so we have tenant ballots in some parts of the country, but they're not mandatory. So I have that kind of bigger concern, and I think there will be some powerful drivers: climate, making buildings safe, and then it's in order to make your building safe and to make sure that we've actually got new stock that meets the requirements of the climate emergency, and thermal comfort must include being able to keep cool. I think that's going to be very problematic. I'll shut up there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff, Nigel. Thanks for that. So other contributors, I'm conscious we've been quite male dominated so far. So anybody want to jump in?
Did I let Siobhan have a go?
Oh, yeah, let's go. If we go Siobhan and then Sheila, please.
Oh, thank you. I was just wondering, because I am the chair of our residents association. I live in high rise in Hackney, and I'm just wondering, do you have any advice about what we can actually do to try and move things forwards a little bit? Because we're stuck in a situation where I feel like I'm constantly asking Peabody for updates and information, and all we know is we've got a B2 rating, and they keep telling us to not worry about it. And I'm just wondering, are there any sort of like practical steps that we can do now that collectively we do have a voice? Like, who should we be shouting at, and what questions, or what should we be saying? Because I feel like I keep out banging my head against a brick wall, to be honest.
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan. That's really good. And Sheila?
A small question is about McCarthy and Stone schemes. A friend of mine's father moved fairly recently into leasehold for the elderly, and now is faced with enormous waking watch charges. And I mean, he's an ordinary working bloke who's managed to get into, buy his way into sheltered housing, owner occupiers, and she's absolutely beside herself, trying to work out what to do to help him. He simply can't afford that fund. I also wanted to make the point that I think Stuart's call for Labour to recognise that housing has been turned into a commodity, I think is really on the agenda. I mean, the front bench is absolutely fully behind the building of 100,000 council houses a year, 150,000 social houses a year, which is the big thing. We're doing quite a lot of work with James Murray on how to help local authorities build council house, publication coming out later in the year. And the other thing that we're doing is to call for housing to be treated as a human right. And that really opens up a lot of what people are calling for tonight, that housing is more than a financial commodity, against the financialisation of housing. And I've been following Leilani Farhat, who was the former UN rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, who's now set up a movement called The Shift, which is all about moving from the financialisation of housing to making sure that it is treated as a human right. Really exciting stuff. It's our 40th anniversary campaign this year. We have a motion going to conference on this. If anybody could move that in their constituency as well, that would be brilliant. But I think that's the answer to what we should be talking about. It meets all of the points about tenants and residents' rights to have a voice as well.
So Helen, excellent advice to me to open it up. A couple of brilliant contributions. Do you want to respond to those?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thank you everybody for all of that. I completely agree with Nigel around the need to be joined up about this and to be linking the works that are going to be necessary and that are necessary around fire safety and fire safety defects to the climate agenda. We've been, I mean, one of the kind of shocking consequences of more than a decade of Tory government and what the Tories did to the planning system very, very early on after 2010, with a kind of huge deregulation of many of the aspects of the planning system that were designed to make genuine progress in relation to climate change, is that we've got more than a decade now of new buildings that require to be retrofitted, and many of those will require to be retrofitted for climate change in the future. And so I think we're missing a trick not to join up those two agendas together. and again, you have to think about the leaseholder costs as well, and the kind, you know, things like the costs of scaffolding, which are enormous, usually an enormous proportion of any kind of major works process. And if you're doing intrusive works and expensive intrusive works, then rolling those things together makes perfect sense. But the kind of big elephant in the room is the funding, and the funding. You know, we have a situation with, and to speak to some of the problems that Robert has rightly drawn attention to around damp and mold and other types of housing problem that have implications for people's health. We haven't had a kind of functioning system for councils to do and housing associations to do routine maintenance to the extent that that's been required for many years now. The money isn't there, and that also then speaks to the point that Nigel was making about regeneration and councils that reach the conclusion that there is no alternative but to demolish properties because the funding is not there for the intrusive and vastly expensive works that are needed to bring them up to standard in multiple different ways. So this all links together. We need comprehensive reform of the regulations, the way our housing sector is funded, the way that land is procured and priced for housing, to make our housing system fair. Just on Siobhan's question about kind of how to make some progress. Siobhan, if you were my constituent, I'd offer to set up a meeting for all of the residents in your block with Peabody to call them to account on their communication and on how they're engaging with you as residents and on mapping out what the way forward is. I don't know who your MP is or who your local councillors are, but I'd sort of really encourage you to get in touch with them and to try to do more to hold them to account publicly, because they you know, it sounds like they're not paying sufficient attention to you as a TNRA, writing to them on behalf of your residents. So you want to get them to speak in a more public context, I think. Sheila's point about McCarthy and Stone, I mean, that's just appalling, isn't it? And that speaks to the issue about the government drawing an arbitrary line around 18 metres for buildings that are eligible for funding and buildings that aren't eligible for any funding at the moment, and many of the sheltered housing leasehold schemes will be under 18 metres because they're inherently kind of low rise, and for pensioners to be trapped in that type of situation is just appalling and dreadful. And then just to that earlier question finally, and then I'll shut up, about how do we organise around this. So I think it's about some of the things that the Labour Party does well. I think we have to be outdoor knocking in the blocks that are likely to be affected by this problem. We have to be speaking to residents directly, understanding what they're going through, and taking details of the case studies, the situations that are in need of resolution. And lots of elected representatives, lots of Labour representatives will be aware of the issues in their patch already. But doing that kind of comprehensive listening exercise and identifying where the problems are in your patch, I think is really important. I think finding the case studies, feeding them through to our front bench so they can use those in challenging the government. We'll have probably a few weeks of line-by-line scrutiny of the Building Safety Bill, which will be an opportunity coming up very soon, which will be an opportunity to be telling those stories, to be putting that to the government, to be calling for the change that we need rather than the change that the government's offering all the time. I think organisations like End Our Cladding Scandal are doing really good. The Leasehold Knowledge Partnership doing really, really good work on these issues. We can be showing our solidarity as the Labour Party with organisations that have expert knowledge and have a wide membership of people who are directly affected by these issues. And we need to be calling for change. We need to be calling out the government on the inadequacy of its approach, calling for them to do better, and laying out our practical proposals, as we are with the Building Works Agency, for the difference that we would make as a Labour government on this agenda, and the plan that we've got to really sort it out from top to bottom.
Great, and also I see that people are kind of self-organising on the chat line, which is great. Anybody who hasn't asked a question want to get a late question in?
Could I ask a quick one, Andy?
Yeah, please.
And hi, Helen, and hi, Paddy. Yeah, I mean, Stuart mentioned earlier on about the wood cladding on buildings. Wood is now seen as a very environmentally sound material that we should be using. We should be using more wood in buildings. And Forest Green Rovers, for instance, have built a whole stadium made of wood. You know, and obviously, you know, it is strongly resistant to fire. So obviously they've treated it. But you also have natural insulations, which again are very much more environmentally sound than some of the toxic materials we have been using in the past. But that doesn't have a high fire safety standard either. I mean, is legislation taking its time to catch up with this, or is there you know, a clash between environmentally sound materials and fire safety, what we should be looking for inside of fire safety?
Phil, can I throw that question at you?
Well, it hasn't been regulated properly. That's the bottom line. This is precisely what we were talking about, with the regulation lagging behind what we know to be fact. There's really strong scientific evidence out there at the moment that shows there's big questions to ask about cross-laminated timber, which is the beefy chunks of timber that are used in buildings of size when they're constructed out of timber. There are clear environmental advantages. Nobody's going to argue with that. And I think we'd all like to be able to say, yes, get building with wood, but it does burn, and they haven't figured out how to stop it burning. It's as simple as that, I'm afraid. And they haven't yet. They haven't yet got the regulations in place that would make me feel comfortable in a building that's made out of wood to that extent. They can't even figure out timber framed buildings yet. We've still got problems trying to make those safe. But in terms of large scale timber structures, you know, there's evidence out there now that there's fire engineers and scientists out there trying to just put the brakes on a little bit and let the regulation catch up, because it's not there. I'd love to be able to say, yes, use lots of wood because we can grow more of it, but the regulation isn't quite there yet. I'd love to see the regulatory side of it race ahead, so that we can build safely with materials that we know are proven to do the job. But I don't think we're there with wood yet, and I put it down to the lack of regulation.
Could I just ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah, please, Paul.
And yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a great answer, Phil. And yeah, I mean, but I always feel that we're very, very slow in this country to regulate and to pass things. I mean, so, you know, wood construction is getting the okay in a lot of countries. You know, their regulation system seems to be, you know, a bit ahead of our own. And with insulation as well, I feel that, you know, again, we're really, really slow in assessing this and either passing it or saying, no, it's, you know, it is a problem. Is that something you feel that that is a problem in this country?
Well, the Ministry of Housing were really clear not long after Grenfell that the reason that they didn't want to have non-flammable insulation is because it would give rock wool a really good foot in the market. And that's because the plastics lobby in this country is absolutely massive. And the reason you're seeing timber getting approved all over the world is because the timber lobby is worth millions, absolutely millions. You know, there's millionaires flying people all over the world with getting access to the highest possible political levels they can to promote plastics and timber. You know, it makes the environmental issue problematic, because they're instead of going in an evidence-driven way, we're going more in a lobby-driven way. Instead of being driven by regulations, we're driven by political influence, and that worries me.
Yeah, that's really strong, Phil. Okay, to conclude, so I knew we were going to have a great discussion tonight. I knew it was going to be important, but this has absolutely exceeded my expectations. Can we just have one last kind of concluding statement from Stuart, Phil, and Helen on where we should be going from here? So, Stuart, do you want to come in quickly?
Yeah, I mean, where should we go from here? I think it's all about organising. I think we've just got to support and empower residents groups to flourish and become independent residents groups. So Phil mentioned Fix My Block as a website, as a good resource. I'm also thinking of the fact that the regulator of social housing has got some more powers and is worth, particularly Siobhan asking about that, the issue with Peabody. They'd be very interested, I think, in learning about how Peabody are consulting and informing and taking fire safety issues seriously, and not kind of just kind of like treating tenants differently, maybe to their leaseholders. I think they'd be very interested in that. I think the regulator is out to make an impression that they're worth their extra powers, and obviously they want funding to go with it. So I think there's existing regulatory bodies that are post-Grenfell are a lot more aware and can be used. I think we still need to try to work on building a national, as Phil would say as well, a national tenants and residents voice that is more than a voice. There's actually an organising platform. Everything tends to get very localised and very fragmented and very tenure divided, and we really need to come together and try to think about a common agenda, which around human rights and around safety and around decommodifying housing potentially could work. And I think anything the Labour Party can do to bring tenants, leaseholders and other residents groups together to help resource local campaigns would be a great place to build, because it's all about now, I think it's all about building I don't want to say mass movement, but I think that is working. When the pressure comes, the government is clearly does not like to be unpopular. I know that they are very unpopular for many of us, but they don't like to be unpopular on certain things. They like to always, Boris likes to be seen to be, with the people. So the more people that can be mobilised on this, then I think we can create get a few more gains in Parliament, while it's obviously very difficult to get with the arithmetic to get anything decent through.
Fabulous, Stuart. Phil?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think if you put about 1 pence on the rent of every social dwelling in the country, then you'd have more than enough money for an independent network to represent tenants and residents, and to push the agenda and to scrutinise what's going on, to take some of these big landlords and hold their feet to the fire a bit, because what they're getting away with is shocking. And the only way we're gonna get any balance to this equation is by empowering a body that can support and represent tenants and residents when they're up against these monstrous organisations with their enormous legal might. We seriously miss a body that can organise and support tenants and residents, and I think it should have been the first thing that was done, really. But for so much as when you look at the way, I think that's how the Ombudsman and the Social Housing Regulator are funded, and it's more than that. But if you want bang for your buck, then give it to tenants and residents, because then we'd really see something happening, wouldn't we? Instead of sitting back and dreaming of proper regulation.
Spot on, Phil. Helen, to finish us off.
Yeah, just to finish. So I think everybody has the right to live in a home that's safe. That's a minimum baseline requirement. Everybody has the right to live in a home that they can afford. Everybody has a right to transparency about the building that they live in and how it is governed and managed and what it's made of and what is needed to keep it safe. And everyone, no one should be charged for things which were not their fault and which couldn't possibly ever have been anticipated. And I think that together, that makes this building safety scandal that was revealed by the Grenfell tragedy, but goes back way before it, an issue of justice. And that makes it an issue that we need to be deeply, deeply concerned about as the Labour Party and as the wider Labour movement. I think we have a broken housing system in the UK, and there are lots of aspects of it that we've touched on this evening around regulation and culture, around funding, and around some of the wider issues like land reform. But we haven't mentioned the private rented sector and the kind of urgent need for reform of the private rented sector as well, and reform of our planning system that is needed. And so this needs to be part of our, and it will be part of the platform that we take into the next general election. It needs to be part of the agenda that we're working on as Labour MPs and as Labour councillors and as communities day by day, week by week. And it needs to be an issue on which we're showing solidarity with the tenants and residents whose lives are deeply impacted by these issues every single day. We're absolutely clear in the proposal for the Building Works Agency that proactive public sector intervention is what is needed here, that this cannot be left to the private sector to in any way self-regulate, self-report, figure it out. It needs comprehensive public sector intervention, and that's what we'll continue to push for, but it's also what we need all of our Labour activists to be campaigning for as well. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant, Helen. Can I thank 3 excellent contributors? As always, can I thank Sheila, our secretary, for doing all the work behind the scenes to make this happen, and probably most importantly, that the self-organising that's been happening in the chat room gets taken forward. So can we say a big thank you to all of our contributors tonight? Okay, thanks everybody, and see you soon.
Thanks a lot. Lovely evening. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah.